She was 12 years old when they handed her a canvas sack and pointed at the trees. No trial, no argument, no goodbye. Just a door closing behind her and the sound of her own footsteps on frozen ground. They called her a thief, her own family, the people who were supposed to know her better than anyone in the world. They were wrong, but that didn't matter. Not then. What mattered was the cold, the dark, the 3 days she spent alone in the wilderness with half a loaf of bread and a small carved bird she kept pressed in her palm like a prayer. Most people would have turned back. Eliza Cross did not turn back. She walked deeper. And on the 4th day, in a forgotten valley, where the old trees grew so tall they blocked out the sky, she found something that changed everything. Not rescue, not a road home, a hollow, ancient island waiting. And buried beneath its floor a secret left by a stranger who had been just as lost as she was. 20 years before she was born, in the same darkness, in the same silence. He didn't know her name, but he knew she was coming. This is the story of a girl who was thrown away and built something extraordinary from nothing. It is also the story of what we leave behind for the people who come after us, and whether that is enough. She was not born difficult. That was the thing no one seemed to understand. She was born curious, born observant, born with a mind that moved sideways when everyone else moved straight. And in Dunmore's Hollow in the autumn of 1849, that was close enough to difficult that no one bothered to tell the difference. The settlement sat at the edge of the Northern Territories like something the land had forgotten to finish. A dozen cabins, a muddy road that turned to ice in October and stayed that way until April. A church with a cracked bell that rang flat every Sunday morning. And people, hard people, good people, some of them. But people who had learned long ago that survival required sameness. That anything which didn't fit the shape of the life they'd built was a problem to be managed. Eliza Cross did not fit the shape. She was 12 years old, small for her age, dark-eyed and quiet in the way that made adults uneasy, the way that made them feel watched without knowing why. She had her mother's narrow hands and her father's stubborn jaw, and absolutely nothing else that belonged to either of them. Her father was Harlan Cross, a man of very few words and very firm opinions. He farmed the same 30 acres his own father had cleared. He went to church every Sunday. He shook hands firmly and looked men in the eye, and never, not once in his adult life, admitted he didn't know something. He was not cruel. That was what people said about him later when the story came out. He was not a cruel man. He was just certain. And certainty, Eliza had learned, was sometimes more dangerous than cruelty, because cruel people occasionally doubted themselves. Certain people never did. Her mother was Helen Cross, softer, quieter. A woman who had once before Harlan and before Dunmore's Hollow been a different kind of person. You could see traces of it sometimes, in the way she hummed while she worked, in the careful, precise stitches she put into everything she sewed, even rough work shirts that no one would ever examine closely, in the single piece of jewelry she owned, a locket, gold, oval, the size of a large thumbnail. She wore it every day, tucked beneath her collar, close to her skin, like a secret she was keeping from the world. She never talked about where it came from. Eliza had learned not to ask. Her brothers were Owen and Declan. Owen was 17 and steady as a fence post, which was both his greatest virtue and his greatest limitation. Declan was 15 and charming in the particular way that very rarely leads anywhere good. He had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes and the smile of a person who had discovered early in life that a good smile could get you out of almost anything. Almost. Eliza was the youngest, the only daughter, and the family member who felt with a quiet and persistent certainty of her own that she had been born into the wrong story. It was Silas Reed who first told her that being in the wrong story wasn't a problem. It just meant you had to write your own. Silas Reed lived at the very edge of Dunmore's Hollow in a cabin so close to the tree line that the pines brushed against his roof when the wind blew. He was old. Nobody knew exactly how old. He had been there before most of the families arrived, and the general assumption was that he had simply always been there, the way the creek had always been there, and the old stone outcropping on the North Hill, and the particular smell of pine resin in the air before rain. He had been a trapper once, a woodsman, and now with hands knotted by years of hard work and cold weather he carved. Birds, mostly. He could take a block of soft pine and find the creature hiding inside it. That was how he described it. Not making something, finding something. The bird is already in there, he would tell Eliza, his voice low and rough and patient. You just have to be quiet enough to see it. Eliza had found her way to Silas's cabin at the age of 7. Following a sound she couldn't identify, a rhythmic scraping that turned out to be his knife moving across a block of pale wood. She had stood in his doorway for a long time, watching. He had not told her to leave. That alone was unusual enough to make her stay. Over the next 5 years, he taught her things, not in the organized, deliberate way of a school teacher, more the way water teaches a riverbed, slowly, constantly, reshaping everything it touches without ever announcing what it's doing. He taught her to read the ground. A deer moves like this, he would say, crouching low over a track in the mud. See the weight. See how the hoof sank deeper on this side. She was heavy or tired, maybe both. Eliza would crouch beside him, studying the impression the way other children studied their primers with total focused attention. He taught her the trees, not just their names, their personalities. The birch that gave you bark for kindling even when it was wet. The hemlock whose needles you could steep into a tea when you had nothing else. The oak, he told her once, pointing at the massive trees that dominated the deeper forest to the east. The oak holds everything. Its bark, its wood, its hollow places. An oak gives you more than any other tree if you know how to ask. She had filed that away. Children like Eliza file everything away. He taught her to use a knife properly, not as a weapon, as a tool. The difference between the two, he said, was intention. And then he gave her a whittling knife of her own, small and sharp and perfectly balanced. And he showed her how to shave away thin curls of pine, following the grain, never fighting it. Her first attempts were disasters. Lumpy, lopsided, completely unrecognizable as anything. Silas would pick them up, turn them over in his palm, and say with perfect seriousness, "I can see where you were going." The wood just disagreed. She loved him for that. She loved him the way you love the person who sees you clearly and doesn't flinch. For her 10th birthday, he gave her a robin carved from a single piece of white birch. Its head tilted at a precise 15 degrees, the way a real robin tilts its head when it's listening to something under the ground. Its eye was a single dot of burned wood, dark and bright at the same time. Its wings were folded against its body with such careful precision that you almost expected it to breathe. Eliza held it in her palm and felt something shift inside her chest. Something that didn't have a name. She kept it in her pocket from that day forward. Every day. Always. The smooth, familiar shape of it pressed against her fingers like a question and an answer at the same time. Silas died the winter she was 11. Peacefully, they said, in his sleep, as if the forest had simply decided it was time to take him back. The settlement stripped his cabin of anything useful within a week. Eliza managed to retrieve his whittling knife before the rest was burned or discarded. She hid it in the lining of her winter coat, wrapped in a scrap of leather. The tools were all she had left of him, but the knowledge was hers too. And knowledge she was beginning to understand was the only thing no one could take from you. The trouble began on a Tuesday. She remembered that specifically. Tuesday, because it was the day her mother beat the rugs and the whole cabin smelled of dust and cold air. And Eliza had been assigned to sweep the floors, which meant she was in every room at some point during the morning, which was later used as evidence. Helen Cross's locket went missing sometime between breakfast and the midday meal. The discovery happened at noon when Helen reached for it, as she always did. A habit so ingrained she probably didn't even know she was doing it. her fingers moving to the spot at her collarbone where the chain sat, and finding nothing. The sound she made was small, but in a quiet cabin, small sounds carry. Harlan Cross said nothing for a long moment after Helen told him. He stood in the center of the main room with his hands at his sides, and that expression on his face, the one that meant his mind was already made up, and the conversation that followed was purely a formality. Eliza watched him from the doorway. She had not taken the locket. She needed that to be clear. Inside her own mind, at least, even if no one else would ever give her the chance to say it out loud. She had not taken it, had not touched it, had not even thought about it. She had been in her parents' room that morning to sweep the floor as instructed, and she had swept the floor and left, and that was the complete and total sum of her involvement with her mother's room. None of that mattered, because Harlan Cross was already looking at her. Not Owen, who was large and simple and direct in a way that made deception seem structurally impossible. Not Declan, who smiled at everyone in a way that somehow put him above suspicion, though it shouldn't have. Eliza, who was quiet, who kept to herself, who spent time in the woods with a dead old man and knew things she hadn't been taught in any proper way. Different, strange, the one who had never quite fit. The logic was so simple, it was almost elegant in its cruelty. There was no discussion, no formal accusation, no moment where Eliza was asked directly, "Did you take it?" There was just the look. The long, terrible look her father gave her across the room. And then the way he turned to her mother and said quietly, "I'll deal with it." Helen did not look at Eliza. That was the thing Eliza kept coming back to afterward, in the long, dark hours, when her mind went where she didn't want it to go. Her mother did not look at her, not once. Stood with her back half turned and her hand pressed over the empty place at her throat, and said nothing. Nothing. She found out later that Owen hadn't been home that morning. He'd been in the far field since before sunrise. She found out later that Declan had been in the settlement near the trading post, talking to a man who passed through every few months. A man with a cart and a quick eye for small, valuable things. But later was later, and right now was right now. Harlan Cross came to the door in the late afternoon when the light was going gray, and the temperature was beginning to drop toward freezing. In his hand was Eliza's small canvas collecting sack, the one she used for mushrooms and herbs and late-season berries. It was heavier than it should have been. He held it out without looking at her face. "Your mother's heart is broken," he said. His voice was flat, final, the voice of a man closing a door. "You'll not stay here and remind her of it." Inside the sack, a half loaf of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, her spare wool tunic, and the whittling knife she'd hidden in the lining of her coat. Someone had found it and included it. She didn't know if that was a kindness or a punishment. She looked at her father's face, the hard set of his jaw, the eyes fixed on the tree line behind her as if she were already gone. She looked past him into the shadows of the cabin. Owen stood against the far wall, his arms crossed, his face turned down. He didn't look at her. Declan was not in the room. Her mother was not in the room. Eliza stood on the threshold of the only home she had ever known and understood with perfect clarity that no words she possessed would change anything. The decision had been made without her. The verdict had been reached without a trial, and the sentence was being carried out with the same quiet efficiency her father applied to every unpleasant task on the farm. She could beg. She could explain. She could stand here until her feet froze to the ground and shout the truth until her voice gave out. None of it would matter because her father was certain, and certainty left no room. So she did something that surprised even herself. She nodded once, a small, clean nod. The kind that meant, I understand. Not I agree, not you are right. Just, I understand what is happening here, and I am choosing how to meet it. She adjusted the strap of the sack on her shoulder. She slipped her right hand into her pocket and closed her fingers around the carved robin. Its familiar weight, its smooth birch white sides. And she turned and walked. She walked past the wood pile she had stacked herself 2 days ago. She walked down the short, muddy path that led from the cabin door to the road. She walked through the gate and kept going without looking back until the last cabin of Dunmore's Hollow had disappeared behind the tree line. And then she stopped and stood very still and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. It was not fear she felt. It was something quieter than fear. Something colder. A kind of hollow, spreading absence, like the feeling after a sound stops and the silence rushes in to fill the space. She was 12 years old. She had a canvas sack with 3 days of food, a knife, a wooden bird. She had the knowledge Silas Reed had spent 5 years putting into her, and she had absolutely nowhere to go. Forward, then. The first rule of survival, Silas had said once, watching a hawk circle over the meadow. When you don't know what to do next, do the thing that keeps you alive long enough to figure it out. She walked toward the deep woods, the ones her father had always said were dangerous. She had never believed that. The forest floor was soft with fallen leaves. Oak and maple, mostly their colors faded from gold and red to the uniform rust brown of late autumn. Each step made a small, crisp sound. The light was gray and diffuse, coming through the canopy at a low angle. The kind of light that makes everything look slightly underwater. The air was cold, clean cold. Not the dead cold of the cabin in winter, the kind that smelled of wood smoke and close-quartered people. This was living cold, sharp with pine, wet with creek smell. The cold of a world that was still doing things, still moving, still changing. Eliza breathed it in and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Just slightly. She angled downhill the way Silas had taught her. Water follows gravity. Gravity leads down. Find the low ground and you'll find the creek. Find the creek and you'll find everything else. She heard it before she saw it. A soft, irregular murmuring water over stones. She followed the sound until the trees opened onto a narrow, moss-banked creek. The water so clear she could see every pebble on the bottom. She knelt and drank. The cold of it went straight to her back teeth. She drank again. This would be her path. She would follow the water east into the old growth, away from any road, any settlement, any person who might bring her back. The first night she made shelter the way Silas had shown her. Low-hanging pine boughs as a roof branch layers banked against the windward side. Not comfortable, but defensible against the wind. She ate a small portion of the bread. Precise. Measured. She needed 3 days of food to stretch to 5, maybe 6. She did not light a fire, not because she couldn't, because she wasn't sure yet who might be looking. The second day was harder. The cold deepened. The bread was running out faster than she'd calculated, which meant her calculations had been optimistic, which meant she needed to do better. She found a clutch of dried blackberries in a south-facing clearing, withered and concentrated, and almost painfully sweet. She ate them slowly, one by one, making them last. The second night, she built a better shelter, tighter, warmer. She banked the floor with dry leaves piled deep enough to insulate from the ground cold. She curled into it like an animal and held the robin against her sternum and listened to the forest breathe around her. An owl called. Something moved in the brush 30 feet to her left. She held still, listened. The pattern of the movement. Too small for a bear, too irregular for a deer. Fox probably, maybe raccoon. She let herself sleep. The third day she got sick. It came on fast the way fever always does. A sudden heat behind her eyes, a heaviness in her limbs that turned her legs unreliable. She stopped at the creek and soaked her scarf in the cold water and held it against the back of her neck and kept moving. She did not stop. Stopping, she understood, with absolute clarity, was not an option. She ate the last of the bread at midday. She ate it slowly, eyes closed, making herself taste every bite. The third night was the worst. She couldn't sleep. Her body was too hot and too cold at the same time, that miserable alternating cycle of fever and chills that made every position uncomfortable and every thought slow and strange. She lay in her shelter and stared at the dark and thought about her mother's face at the window. That look, not anger, not conviction, something worse. Something that looked like I know, and I cannot say it. I know, and the cost of saying it is higher than I am able to pay. Eliza lay in the dark and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but somewhere in the exact space between the two. And then she was done with it. She folded it up, put it somewhere deep and internal and not immediately accessible, and went to sleep. The fourth day, the fever broke before dawn. She woke cold and clear-headed and hollow with hunger, and knew immediately today she would find something permanent. Not another night camp. Something real. The landscape had been changing for 2 days. The mixed forest of pine and hardwood giving way to something older. Trees she recognized from the far edge of what she'd known, the great old specimens that Silas had pointed to on clear days when the visibility was good. The ones he called the grandfathers. She was in the deep old growth now. The trees here were immense, their trunks wider than she could reach around their canopies, so dense that the forest floor was in perpetual shadow, quiet and still, and carpeted with centuries of accumulated leaf mold. No wind reached the floor here, no sound from the world outside. It felt like being inside something. She followed the creek around a long, slow bend, and the valley opened up. A natural hollow, sheltered on 3 sides by a ridge that caught the wind. A small meadow no larger than a house lot, with the creek running along its eastern edge. And in the center of the hollow, standing apart from everything else, as if the other trees had stepped back to give it room, was the oak. Eliza stopped. She stood very still. She had seen large trees. Silas had shown her old growth on the edge of Dunmore's territory, trees that had been standing for 100 years before anyone arrived to name them. But this was something else. This oak was not large the way other trees were large. It was large the way mountains were large, the way rivers were large. It occupied space with a permanence that made the word large seem too small for what it was doing. Its trunk was wider than her family's cabin. Its roots had broken the surface of the ground and curved back in arches you could walk beneath. The bark was ridged and dark and ancient, layered over itself in patterns that looked less like tree bark and more like a landscape, a topography of decades compressed into vertical surface. And in its side, facing south toward the winter sun, there was an opening. Not a wound, not damage, just an absence. A natural hollow where a massive limb had once separated from the trunk, centuries ago perhaps, and the living wood had slowly grown around the loss, leaving a dark mouth in the side of the tree, tall enough to walk through without ducking, wide enough for 2 people. Eliza approached it carefully, knife in hand, the old habit. Check before you enter. She stood at the opening and let her eyes adjust to the interior darkness. Listened. Breathed in. No animal smell. No wet rot. Dry air, cool and still smelling of old wood and dry leaf dust. She stepped inside. The hollow was larger than she'd expected. A circular interior, perhaps 8 feet across the walls, the dark and ridged inner wood of the oak. The floor was deep in old leaf litter and compacted soil, dry and dusty. High above where the hollow narrowed toward the living trunk, a small gap let in a single shaft of gray light that moved imperceptibly across the floor as the sun moved. It was quiet, not the empty quiet of absence, the full quiet of a place that had been holding its silence for a very long time. She walked the perimeter, slowly running her fingers along the walls. Solid, hard. The wood of a living tree, not a dead one. This wasn't a shell waiting to collapse. This was a room inside something still alive. She set her canvas sack in the center of the floor. The sound it made was small, ordinary. The sound of something being put down. She exhaled, and then she started to work. She cleared the floor the way Silas had taught her to approach any task. Systematically, from the edges inward. Using a wide, flat piece of bark as a crude shovel, she scraped the centuries of accumulated debris toward the opening and hauled it outside in armloads, piling it against the base of the tree where it would add insulation to the lower walls. It was hard work, repetitive and slow, and her hands were sore within the first hour. She did not stop. She had learned in the past 4 days that her body had more capacity than she had previously been asked to test. It complained a great deal. It could also, when required, ignore its own complaints. She worked through the afternoon. The floor gradually emerged. Packed earth, dark and firm, surprisingly level. In one corner, the root of the oak plunged through the wall and curved across the floor, a natural shelf. She made a note of it. Useful. Then her piece of bark struck something. A different sound. Not the soft thud of hitting earth. Not the dull knock of a buried root. A hollow sound, like knocking on a door. She stopped, knelt, brushed the loose soil away with her hands. A stone edge appeared. Gray, square-cornered, too regular to be natural. She brushed further. The whole surface emerged a flat flagstone the size of a large book, its edges precise and deliberate. A root had grown over one corner, anchoring it in place. The root was as thick as her wrist. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took Silas's knife. It took an hour to saw through the root. The fibrous wood was tough and the work was detailed, and her arm ached before she was halfway through. But eventually the blade broke free. She wedged her fingers into the gap, pulled. The stone was heavy, much heavier than it looked. She adjusted her grip. pulled again. It shifted. She got her full body into it, shoulders down, legs driving. And with a grating sound that seemed enormous in the silence of the hollow, the stone tilted and came free. Beneath it was a hole. Not an accidental hole. A rectangular depression cut into the hard earth with clear, deliberate edges. The kind of hollow you made with a tool and a purpose. And inside the hollow was a bundle, dark oilcloth, wrapped carefully, tied with a leather cord so old and dry it crumbled slightly at her touch. Eliza sat back on her heels for a moment and simply looked at it. Her heart was moving faster than was strictly necessary. She reached into the hollow and lifted the bundle out. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the entrance where the failing afternoon light was strongest, and set it on the ground, and unwound the leather cord, and folded back the stiff, cracked oilcloth. Dry moss inside, carefully packed. 3 objects nested in it. A leather pouch, small and dense with weight. She loosened the drawstring and poured the contents into her palm. Coins, silver, old from the weight and the worn faces of them, but silver unmistakably. She counted them slowly. 23. She sat with them in her palm for a long moment. 23 silver coins. She had never owned a single coin in her life. The second object was a knife. Not a whittling knife, a real working knife, the kind a trapper would carry. Its wooden handle was dark with years of use worn smooth in exactly the places a hand would grip it. The blade was fine dark steel, and when she drew her thumb very carefully across the edge, she felt the sharpness even through the caution of her touch. The third object was a book, a small journal. Its leather cover was warped and stiff. She opened it carefully. The pages crackled. The handwriting inside was clear and unhurried, the hand of someone who had thought carefully about each sentence before committing it to paper. And tucked inside the front cover was a letter, folded, sealed with wax that had gone brown and brittle with age. On the outside, in the same careful hand, to whoever finds this. She broke the seal. The ink inside had faded from black to a warm, dark brown. She held the page close to the light and read, "My name is Augustus Hale. I was a silversmith by trade from the Eastern Territories before circumstances brought me to these woods in the autumn of 1831. I will not explain those circumstances here. They are mine, and I have made my peace with them. What I will say is this: I came to these woods broken, and this hollow oak, this ancient and patient tree, kept me alive when nothing else would. I lived here for 2 winters. I trapped and I survived, and I thought for the first time in many years without anyone telling me what to think. The coins in the pouch are my earnings from those 2 seasons. They are not a fortune, but they are honestly made, every one of them. The knife was my father's. It has served me well. May it serve you equally. I do not know who you are or what has brought you here. I do not need to know. This hollow has a way of choosing its people. If you are reading this, it chose you. That is enough. Use what I have left. Build what they told you that you could not. Do not let what was done to you become the thing that defines you. You are not what happened to you. You are what you do next. This place kept me. I pray it keeps you too. Do not be afraid of the silence. It is not emptiness. It is space. To whoever finds this, may it be your anchor in the storm. Augustus Hale, November 1831. Eliza read the letter twice, then a third time. Then she sat with it in her hands and looked at the evening coming into the hollow through the wide entrance, the light going gold and thin between the great trees, and she felt something move through her that she didn't have a word for yet. He had been here. He had been right here in this same darkness, in this same silence. He had been as alone as she was, as lost, as stripped of everything. And he had stayed and built and left something behind for the person who would come after. She was not the first. The hollow had kept someone before her. It was going to keep her too. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back with the journal. She picked up the silver coins and closed them in her fist. She felt the weight of them. Real weight. Actual solid material possibility. Then she turned back to the hollow, to her home, and she picked up the piece of bark, and she went back to work. But as she cleared the last corner of the floor, her bark scraper caught one more time. Not on a stone, on something smaller. She brushed the dirt aside with her fingers, careful now, and found a small folded scrap of paper much newer than Augustus's letter pressed into a crack at the base of the wall. She opened it. The handwriting was different, shakier, written in haste or in the dark, or both. I was here. I found what you left. I was not brave enough then. I am leaving something in return at the hearthstone beneath the third stone from the left. Forgive me. Forgive her. No name. Just a small drawing in the corner. A flower. A single iris sketched in a few careful lines. Eliza stared at it. Her mind was very still. She did not know what it meant yet, but she would. She tucked the scrap of paper inside the journal with Augustus's letter. She looked around the hollow, at the walls that were hers now. At the floor she had cleared with her own hands. At the single shaft of light from the gap high above, moving slowly across the packed earth as the last of the afternoon passed. She was 12 years old. She had been cast out with 3 days of food, and the word thief following her like a shadow. And she had found something that no one in Dunmore's Hollow would have predicted. Not rescue, not a road home. Something older and stranger and more sustaining than either. A beginning. The first thing she built was a door. Not because she was afraid, because a door meant you had something worth protecting. And Eliza Cross, 12 years old, standing in the center of a hollow oak, with 23 silver coins and a dead man's knife, had decided she did. She spent the first full day at the creek, cutting saplings, young willows mostly flexible and straight, their wood pale and cooperative under the blade. She cut 24 of them, each one the length of her arm span, and dragged them back to the hollow in bundles. Then she wove them, slowly, patiently, the way Silas had once showed her how to weave a fish trap over and under and over again, the pattern simple, but the execution requiring more attention than it looked like it should. Her hands got it wrong 3 times before they got it right. The 4th attempt held. She lashed the edges with strips of bark soaked soft in the creek. Let it dry overnight, propped against the outer wall of the tree. In the morning, it was stiff and solid, and when she fitted it against the opening, it blocked the wind completely. She stood back and looked at it. A door. Hers. She felt something move through her chest. Small and warm and slightly ridiculous given the circumstances, but real. Then she got back to work. The problem of fire took her 3 days to solve properly. She knew she needed heat. The temperature was dropping faster now, the mornings arriving, with a thin rime of frost on the grass, the afternoons never warming above a dull gray chill. She had survived the crossing of the forest without fire, but she could not survive winter without it. Not here. Not in a tree, however well built. But a fire in the center of a hollow oak was not a fire. It was a catastrophe waiting. She studied the problem the way Silas had taught her to study problems, from every angle, without rushing to a solution before you understood the shape of the difficulty. The tree's inner wall was thickest at the back. The grain of the wood there was dense and old, centuries of compression, making it almost stone-like. And high above, where the hollow narrowed the natural gap in the trunk that let in her shaft of morning light, was directly above the back wall. Draft, she thought. If the smoke went up, if it had somewhere to go. She spent 1 full day hauling clay from the creek bank. Gray-blue river clay, dense and plastic, the kind that held its shape. She packed it into her collecting sack and made 8 trips before she had enough. Then she spent 2 more days building. A small contained basin at the base of the back wall, lined with flat stones from the creek. A narrow flue rising from it, constructed from clay bricks she shaped with her hands and let dry in the thin autumn sun before stacking them. Each brick fitting against the next, the channel narrowing as it climbed, directing toward the gap above. It was the most technical thing she had ever attempted. It was also deeply imperfect. The first 3 fires she lit smoked badly, filled the hollow with a stinging gray haze that sent her outside, coughing eyes watering, seriously reconsidering the entire project. She sat on a root outside and thought about it. The gap was too small, or the flue was too wide, or both. She rebuilt the upper section of the flue, narrowed it, angled it slightly toward the prevailing draft, lit the fourth fire, held her breath. The flame caught, held, and a thin ribbon of smoke rose from the basin, climbed the clay channel, and was pulled cleanly upward through the gap in the trunk. The hollow filled with warmth, not the aggressive heat of a roaring fire, a gentle radiating warmth spreading from the back wall outward, reaching into every corner.
The kind of warmth that gets into your bones rather than just your skin.
Eliza sat down on the floor in the middle of her home and stared at the small flame and did not move for a very long time. She was going to be all right. She was actually going to be all right. The bed came next, because sleeping on the ground was survivable, but it was also, she had decided, unnecessary. She was not going to survive winter. She was going to live through it. There was a difference. She built a platform from stout branches, notched and fitted at the corners, the way she'd seen Silas construct his trapping frames. Raised it a foot off the ground on 4 short leg posts. Wove a lattice of flexible branches across the top. Then she spent 3 days harvesting pine boughs from the trees at the edge of the meadow, cutting them at the base where they were thickest and most fragrant, carrying them back in armloads until she had enough to pile them on the platform in a layer 6 inches deep. She lay down on it that first night. The pine needles released their scent under her weight, filling the hollow with the smell of deep forest, clean and sharp and alive. The warmth from the hearth reached her through the platform. The door blocked the wind. She closed her eyes and slept properly. For the first time since the door of her father's cabin had closed behind her, she dreamed of nothing, which was exactly what she needed. The trapping came later when she had the basic structure of the hollow established, and her mind was free to think beyond immediate necessity. She had been eating carefully, using 1 silver coin at the trading post she'd found 2 days' walk to the southwest. A rough-built place at the junction of 2 old trails where a man with a weathered face and a complete absence of curiosity sold flour and salt and dried beans to whoever appeared with coin. He had not asked her age. He had not asked her name. He had taken her coin and counted back the correct change and loaded her purchases into her sack and gone back to whatever he had been doing before she arrived. She had felt walking away a profound gratitude for people who minded their own business. But coin was finite. She had 22 left after the first purchase and 21 after the second, and the arithmetic of her situation was clear enough. She needed a way to generate supply that did not diminish her reserves. She set snares along the creek the way Silas had shown her. Simple loop snares for rabbits set at ground level against fallen logs where the animals ran. She checked them every morning at first light, moving carefully, making no more noise than necessary. The first morning empty. The second, a rabbit clean caught. She skinned it the way Silas had taught her, quickly, precisely, thanking it under her breath in the way he had always done. Not because she was sure anything was listening, because it seemed right to acknowledge what you were taking. She smoked the meat over her small fire, slow and low, the way he'd shown her for preservation. Stored it wrapped in oilcloth on the natural shelf the root made in the corner of the hollow. The hide she stretched on a frame of bent branches. Let it dry, and began to think about the rabbit blanket she was going to need before the deep cold arrived. The days acquired a shape. Dawn check snares, clean and reset. Return with whatever she'd caught. Morning tend the fire. Eat. Work on whatever the current project was. Afternoon gather. Firewood mostly building the pile outside the hollow into a stack that grew higher every week. But also moss from the creek rocks, which mixed with clay, made an excellent chinking material for the gaps in the walls. Also, late mushrooms, the winter varieties that Silas had taught her to identify, dense and meaty, and nothing like the poisonous ones if you knew what you were looking for. Evening, the journal. She read Augustus Hale's journal every evening by firelight. Not always from the beginning. Often she would open it at random and read whatever page presented itself. His entries were spare, practical. The weather, the state of his traps, the condition of the creek. Occasionally something more. November 14th, 1831. Heavy frost last night. The hollow held well against it. I have begun to understand why the old trappers spoke of certain trees the way other men speak of houses. A good tree is not shelter. It is partnership. She read that one several times. Partnership. Yeah. December 2nd, 1831. I have not spoken to another person in 31 days. I find to my considerable surprise that I do not miss it the way I expected to. What I miss is being known. Not conversation, not company. The particular ease of being with someone who does not require explanation. She set the journal down after that entry. Stared at the fire for a long time. She understood that perfectly. The mystery of the smaller note nagged at her in quiet moments. The shaky handwriting, the iris, the reference to a hearthstone and the third stone from the left. She hadn't found the hearthstone yet because she hadn't known where to look when she'd first read it. But now she had a hearthstone. She had built one herself at the base of the back wall. She counted from the left. 1 stone, 2, 3. She worked the third stone loose with the point of Augustus's knife. It came free with some effort, revealing a small cavity behind it barely the size of her fist. Empty. She sat back, frowned. Then she looked at the note again. The third stone from the left. She had been counting from her left, facing the wall. She tried from the other direction. 1 stone, 2, 3. This stone was set slightly differently from the others. A hairline gap around its edge. She worked the knife into the gap. The stone came free. Behind it was a small cavity, and in the cavity was a bundle of cloth, no bigger than a folded handkerchief. She lifted it out, unwrapped it carefully. The locket was gold, oval, the size of a large thumbnail, on a fine chain so delicate it looked like it might dissolve at a touch, but didn't. The surface was engraved with a pattern of small leaves around the edge, worn almost smooth but still visible. Eliza knew this locket. She had seen it every day of her life, around her mother's throat. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she opened it. No portrait inside. No lock of hair. Just a small folded square of paper, so tightly compressed it had taken the shape of the locket interior. She unfolded it with extreme care. The paper was fragile, the fold lines almost transparent. The handwriting was her mother's. She knew it from the shopping lists, from the careful labels on the preserving jars, from the few letters she'd seen Helen write sitting at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, her pen moving across the page with a deliberateness that suggested she was choosing every word twice before committing it. It said, "I took it. I meant to give it to you before they sent you away, and I could not make myself speak. I am a coward, but you are not. You never were. This was always meant to be yours, your mother." Eliza read it once, twice, set it down, picked it up again. Her mother had taken the locket. Not Declan, not some passing stranger, not a gap in Helen Cross's memory that her grief had filled with her daughter's face. Helen, who had stood at the window with her hand pressed to her throat and not looked at Eliza as she walked away. Who had not spoken. Who had let the silence confirm what Harlan's certainty had already decided. Helen had taken her own locket, had meant to give it as a goodbye, as a provision for the journey, as the only thing she had that was worth anything to pass to the child she could not protect, and had not been able to do it. Had watched Eliza walk away into the cold and kept the locket, and then at some point 3 years before Eliza arrived, had made the journey to this hollow, had found Augustus's cache, had read his letter, had left the locket and her confession in the place she must have hoped, or perhaps only prayed her daughter would someday find. Forgive me. Forgive her. The note in the journal, her mother's handwriting, her mother's iris, the signature of a woman who could not say the necessary thing to the person's face, and had therefore said it to a hollow tree in the deep woods, and trusted something she couldn't name to carry it forward. Eliza sat with the locket in her palm. The fire crackled quietly in its clay basin. Outside, the wind moved through the upper canopy of the oak. The sound it made was not frightening. It was exactly what Augustus had said. Space. Not emptiness. Space. She was not ready yet to decide what she felt about this. So she folded the letter, placed it back inside the locket, placed the locket back in its cloth, put the cloth in the inner pocket of her coat against her ribs where the carved robin lived. 2 small things, both given without expectation of return. One from a stranger, one from a woman who hadn't been brave enough when it mattered and had found her courage too late and aimed it at an empty tree in the woods. Eliza closed her eyes. Winter arrived without ceremony. One morning she woke, and the world outside the hollow was white. Deep and clean and absolute, the snow having fallen overnight in the silent way it does when there is no wind straight down, coating every branch and root and stone with an even perfect layer. She stood at the entrance of the hollow and looked at it. The valley was transformed, still, white. The creek still audible beneath its thin lid of ice. The great roots of the oak around her dusted with snow, like the ruins of something ancient. It was beautiful, astonishingly, undeniably beautiful, and she was ready for it. That was the thing. That was the thing she hadn't expected when she'd been calculating firewood and food stores and the insulating properties of moss and clay chinking. She had not expected to feel ready. Prepared, yes, that was engineering. But ready was something different. Ready meant I am not afraid of what is coming. I have met it on honest terms and made my arrangements, and now let it come. She went inside and stoked the fire, and winter came. It came hard and long and unrelenting in the way of that latitude. Temperatures she felt in her joints when she moved. Mornings when the inside of the hollow was cold despite the banked fire, and she could see her breath even wrapped in her rabbit skin blanket. Snowfall that accumulated faster than she could keep the entrance clear, so that some mornings she had to push her door open against the resistance of a fresh foot of snow. She adapted. She had been cold before. Silas had taken her out in winter weather deliberately early in their years together, specifically, so she would know what it felt like and know she could manage it. Cold is information, he had said. Your body is telling you what it needs. Listen to it. Don't argue with it. Just listen and respond. She listened. She learned that she needed to move more on the coldest days, not less. That her snares needed checking earlier because the frozen ground held the animal's warmth longer, and she needed to be there before anything else was. That the fire needed smaller, more frequent feeding in deep cold, rather than larger logs less often. She learned her own rhythms. And she was not lonely. That was the strangest thing. the thing she returned to again and again in the long evenings by the fire. She had lived her entire life surrounded by family and had felt persistently and guiltily alone. Here, in actual solitude, she felt something entirely different, accompanied by the journal, by Augustus's voice speaking to her from 1831, practical and wry, and occasionally unexpectedly funny, by the slow companionship of the animals she had come to know. The red fox who sometimes sat at the edge of the meadow in the early morning, watching her check snares with an expression of professional evaluation. The chickadees who had decided, apparently by committee, that the roof of her hollow was an acceptable roosting spot, and whose small, busy sounds she could hear above her on still mornings. By the robin in her pocket, by the locket against her ribs, by the strange, warm weight of being known even at a distance, even imperfectly, even too late. Spring arrived the way it always does in that country, reluctantly, in stages, with several convincing false starts that the old-timers in settlements like Dunmore's Hollow called the mud season when the snow retreats. But the ground is not yet ready to accept the warmth, and everything is brown and saturated, and the air smells of cold water and possibility. Eliza felt it change before she saw it. Something in the quality of the light, the angle of the morning sun through her high gap hitting the floor just slightly differently. The sound of the creek increasing the snowmelt from the ridge feeding it until it ran quick and high over its banks. She began ranging further, not because she needed to, because she could. Because the longer days gave her more light, and the easing cold gave her more range, and she had over winter become intensely curious about the extent of her territory. She thought of it as hers, not in the way of ownership, in the way of a shepherd who knows every inch of the pasture, in the way of someone who has paid attention long enough to have responsibility. She found the boundary of the old growth to the west, a line where the ancient trees gave way abruptly to younger forest, the result of some long ago clearing she couldn't quite date. Beyond it, the land opened slightly, a different quality of light. She found a second creek, a tributary of her main water, running down from the ridge in a narrow, rushing channel before joining the larger flow. Good water, colder, faster. She logged it in her mental map with the precision Silas had taught her. She found on a morning in late March the first sign that she was not entirely alone in this part of the woods. A trap, steel-jawed, set well. The placement suggesting someone who knew what they were doing, positioned along a game trail she had identified weeks ago as a primary mink route. She backed away from it without touching it and stood very still, thinking. Someone else worked these woods. She had known intellectually that this was probable. The trading post existed because someone used it. The trails she'd found bore occasional signs of older use boot prints long weathered cut notches in trees that served as waymarks. But knowing intellectually and encountering actual evidence were different things. She went home. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she went back to the trap. It had been recently tended. The bait refreshed, which meant the person was active, working a circuit probably, coming back to each trap on a rotation. She made a decision. She sat down on a fallen log 20 feet from the trap and waited. He appeared 2 hours later, old. Not ancient in the way of Silas Reed. Old in the way of a man who had spent 40 years in hard weather and had the face to show for it. Tall and lean, dressed in layered buckskin, moving through the trees with a quietness that she recognized immediately as the real thing, not performance. His rifle was slung across his back, not in his hands. His eyes were already moving when he emerged from the tree line. He saw her immediately. Stopped. They looked at each other across 20 feet of spring mud and new grass. He did not reach for his rifle. She kept her hands visible. He looked at her for a long moment, at the condition of her clothes, patched but clean, at the knife at her belt, at the calm steadiness of her expression. "How long?" he said. "Since autumn." He looked at the trees, at the general direction of the hollow. Alone? Yes. A silence. "You made it through the winter." It was not a question. He was looking at her and reaching conclusions the way a man who has spent 40 years reading the woods reads everything else. "I did." He nodded slowly, set his hands on his hips. "My name is Jonah Ward," he said. "I've been running this circuit since before you were born." "Eliza Cross." Another silence, longer. "You found the oak," he said. She looked at him carefully. "You know it. Every trapper in these hills knows it. Nobody lives there, though. Too deep, too old." He paused. "Nobody until, apparently, now." He came to the hollow that afternoon. She showed him what she'd built. Not with pride exactly. More in the way you show a craftsman your work when you want an honest evaluation and are prepared to hear it. He walked the perimeter of the hollow, looked at the clay chimney, the raised bed, the door, the stacked firewood still substantial despite the winter's usage. He examined the chinking on the walls. He looked at the food stores on the root shelf. He said nothing for a long time. Then, "How old are you?" 12, almost 13. He looked at her steadily. "Where are your people?" "I don't have people." He accepted that without comment, in the way of a man who understood that some answers needed no elaboration. "I can trade," she said. "I have pelts. I trapped through the winter. Good furs." He looked at the stretched hides she had on the drying frames outside. "Those are well prepared," he said. "I know." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "I can bring you things on my circuit. he said. What do you need? Steel needle, heavy thread, and if you can find it, a cast iron pot. He nodded slowly. I'll be back in 2 weeks. He was. He brought a heavy needle and a spool of waxed linen thread. He took 4 of her best rabbit pelts and 2 mink. He came back a month after that with a small cast iron pot dented on one side, but sound, and she paid him with one of Augustus's silver coins without hesitation. That's too much, he said, looking at the coin. It's what it's worth to me, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pocketed the coin. Their exchanges were like that. Clean, transactional, but not cold. He did not ask questions she hadn't offered answers to. She did not ask for help she hadn't established she needed. They met somewhere in the middle of a mutual respect that felt to Eliza
like the most straightforward relationship he had ever had with another person. He mentioned Nora Alcott on his 3rd visit.
There's a woman, he said, folding his payment of pelts into his pack. Lives on a homestead about half a day east. Widow. Been out here longer than most. She asked about you. Eliza looked up from her work. She knows about me. Word travels in the woods. Not fast, but it travels. He adjusted the pack. I told her you were managing. She said she wanted to meet you. A pause. Why? Jonah looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I think she'd tell you herself better than I could. Nora Alcott's homestead was a half-day's easy walk east along the secondary creek. A proper cabin, small but solid, with a kitchen garden just beginning to show green at the edges of its tilled plot, and a yard that was clean in the particular way of someone who had decided long ago that orderliness was not a luxury, but a necessity. The woman who appeared in the doorway was not what Eliza expected. Not that she had expected anything specific, only that Nora Alcott in person was more substantial than the impression she had formed from Jonah's sparse description. 58 years old, gray-haired, but not in the worn-down way of women who had simply stopped. Gray-haired in the way of someone who had earned it and did not particularly mind. She looked at Eliza for a long moment. Then she said, "Come in. I have coffee." The cabin inside was neat, not decorative neat, functional neat. Every object had a place. Every surface was clear. The kind of space that communicated without saying a word that the person who lived here had thought carefully about what they needed and had no patience for what they didn't. Eliza sat at the kitchen table. Nora put a tin mug in front of her. She had not had coffee since before autumn. She wrapped both hands around the mug and inhaled it before she drank it. Nora sat across from her and looked at her with the direct, calibrated attention of someone who had been reading people for a long time. Jonah says you built your own chimney. Clay brick and river stone. Did it work? 3rd try. The corner of Nora's mouth moved. I built mine in 2 tries, she said. But I had tools. A silence. Comfortable somehow. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say. The silence of two people who understood that conversation was for when you had something worth adding. "He told me you've been alone since autumn," Nora said. "Yes." "How old are you?" "Almost 13. Nora looked at her hands around the mug, at the calluses, at the healed cuts across her knuckles from the clay work, at the careful economy of how she held herself. "My husband died 13 years ago," Nora said. "My son sold the farm and moved to town, left me the cabin and the garden and not much else." She said it without bitterness, the way you state a fact that has been examined so many times, it no longer has the power to surprise you. "I had to learn most of what I know after I was 45 years old." Eliza looked at her. "You managed," she said. "I did." Nora met her eyes. "So will you." Not "you will be fine," not "I'll help you," not some softened version of reassurance designed to make a frightened child feel better. Just "so will you." As if it were already decided, already fact. Simply a matter of time working itself out. Eliza felt something release in her chest. Small. Quiet. The loosening of something she hadn't known was held tight. She visited Nora every few weeks through the spring. Sometimes they talked, about practical things mostly. Nora had knowledge Eliza lacked, particularly around the preservation of food, the timing of planting, the management of winter stores. She showed Eliza how to dry herbs in the proper sequence to preserve their potency, how to smoke meat in a way that lasted longer than Eliza's current method, how to read the sky in spring for late frost warnings. Eliza showed Nora where the ginseng grew, and the stand of hickory she'd found whose nuts dried properly could stretch a winter's food stores considerably. They traded knowledge the way she and Jonah traded goods. Clean, honest, equal. One afternoon, when the spring was fully established and the woods smelled of warm earth and new growth, Nora said, without particular preamble, "A woman came through here 3 years ago, maybe 4, on foot. She asked about the big oak in the eastern valley." Eliza set down her cup. "What did she look like?" Nora described her. Medium height, dark eyes, narrow hands. The way she held herself that suggested she had been at some point a different kind of person than she currently appeared. She'd been crying or had been recently. She didn't offer a name. "I pointed her east," Nora said, "toward the valley." She paused. She seemed like she was going somewhere specific, like she already knew the place existed and just needed to confirm the direction. Eliza was very still. "Did she come back this way?" "No, never saw her again." The narrow hands, the dark eyes, the way she held herself. Eliza knew. She knew before Nora finished the description, had known probably from the first sentence. The particular way her stomach had tightened when Nora started talking, the body recognizing what the mind was still assembling. Her mother had been here 3 years before Eliza arrived, had walked from Dunmore's Hollow to this exact part of the forest, had stopped to ask directions from the nearest homesteader, had gone to the oak, had left the locket, had left the letter. Forgive me. Forgive her. Eliza sat very quietly for a while. Nora did not push. That was the thing about Nora Alcott. She had the patience of someone who had learned the hard way that most things given sufficient space would eventually surface on their own. Finally, Eliza said, "She's my mother." Nora looked at her for a long moment. "I thought she might be," she said. A silence. "She left something for me," Eliza said. "At the oak. Did you find it?" "Yes." Another silence. Longer. "Was it what you needed?" Nora asked. Eliza thought about the locket in its cloth against her ribs, about the letter in her mother's careful handwriting, each word chosen twice, about the small drawing of an iris and the confession of a woman who had been afraid. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Nora nodded, as if that were the most reasonable answer in the world. "You don't have to know yet," she said. "Some things take a while." On the way home that evening, Eliza walked slowly through the deepening spring dusk, the forest around her green and soft and full of sound, the frogs in the creek, the thrushes beginning their evening chorus, the particular creak of old branches settling as the temperature dropped. She put her hand in her pocket and held the carved robin, its smooth, familiar weight. She thought about Augustus Hale alone in this same forest in 1831, writing in his journal about partnership, about the ease of being with someone who required no explanation. She thought about her mother walking this same path 3 years ago, frightened, remorseful, following a trail she had never walked before to a place she had only heard of in order to leave a confession and a piece of gold in a hollow tree, because she did not know any other way to reach her daughter. She thought about Jonah Ward, who had found a 12-year-old girl sitting 20 feet from his trap and had, without commentary or question, treated her as someone worth treating, as an equal. She thought about Nora, who had said, "So will you," as if it were the simplest fact in the world. She was not the girl who had been cast out anymore. She was not sure exactly what she was instead. But she was becoming something. She could feel it the way you feel a change in the weather before you can name it. In the quality of the air, in the way the light hit things differently. Something was shifting. She walked home through the spring woods, and behind her, the valley settled into its evening quiet, and the great oak stood in the center of it, as it had stood for centuries, patient and permanent, and holding everything. The summer she turned 13, Eliza Cross stopped counting the days, not because she had lost track, because she had stopped needing to. The days had become something she lived inside rather than something she measured. The rhythm of the hollow, the fire, and the snares, and the creak, and the long, slow arc of light across her floor from dawn to dusk had become the rhythm of her own body. She didn't wake at dawn because she made herself. She woke because the light came and her body answered it. That was a different kind of being in the world. She had not known that before. The summer passed the way good summers do in deep country, long and warm and full of work that felt like its own reward. She expanded her trapping range. She dried enough meat and mushrooms and hickory nuts to fill the entire root shelf and build a second one beside it. She patched her door twice and reinforced the chimney with a fresh layer of clay that she fired harder than the first version. She carved. That was new. Or not new exactly. She had whittled since Silas taught her small, rough things that kept her hands busy on long evenings. But this summer, something shifted. She stopped making small, rough things and started making considered ones. She studied the grain of each piece of wood the way Silas had taught her, looking for what was already in there, and she began to find it. A fox caught mid-step, one paw lifted, a deer with its head raised, ears forward, listening, a woman sitting very still with her hands in her lap. She didn't know why she carved the woman. She carved her without deciding to. Found the shape emerging under the knife one evening and followed it without questioning. She put it on the root shelf and looked at it for a long time. Then she put it face down. Then she turned it back over. Then she left it alone. Autumn came, and Bram Cole came with it. She heard him before she saw him. Not because he was loud, because she had learned over 2 seasons in these woods to hear things that were quiet. A displacement of air, a pattern of footsteps that belonged to a biped, not a quadruped. A pause in the forest sound that meant something with deliberate intent was moving through it. She was at the creek checking her last snare of the morning when she heard him. She went still, waited. He emerged from the eastern tree line 10 minutes later, moving carefully, looking at the ground. Following the creek upstream. Not hunting. Something else. The posture of a man looking for something specific. He was 35, maybe 40. Brown-haired, weather-brown, dressed well for the woods, but not in the practical, layered way of someone who lived in them. Visitor's clothes. Good boots with city construction that had not been made for this terrain. He had a leather satchel over one shoulder. He had not seen her yet. She stepped out from behind the willow screen at the creek's edge. He stopped. They looked at each other across 15 feet of autumn grass. "You're the girl," he said. Not a question. Recognition. Depends who's asking. He almost smiled. "My name is Bram Cole." He held up one hand, palm out, the universal language. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm looking for a place, an oak tree, very large, in a valley." He paused. I think you know it. Eliza studied him. The eyes were honest, or at least they were trying to be, which was sometimes the same thing. Why? My great-uncle lived here once, a long time ago. He shifted the satchel on his shoulder. Augustus Hale. Silence, the name landing in the autumn air between them like a stone in still water. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned. "Follow me," she said, "and stay on the path." He saw the hollow and stopped walking. She watched his face. He was not seeing a hollow tree. He was seeing something else. Something that had a name in his family's history. A place that had been spoken about in the careful way people speak about things that carry more weight than they can fully explain. He stood at the entrance for a long time without speaking. Then he stepped inside. She let him look. He moved slowly around the perimeter. He looked at the clay chimney, the raised bed, the carved shelf with its stores, the fox and the deer and the woman sitting still. He looked at all of it with an expression she recognized, the expression of a person recalibrating. He described it, Bram said finally. In letters, in the last years of his life. He turned to face her. He described a hollow oak, a valley, a creek. He said he left things here. A pause. He said he hoped someone would find them. Someone did, Eliza said. Bram looked at her steadily. Was it enough? She thought about the winter, about 23 silver coins and a dead man's knife and a journal that had become her most consistent companion. About the chimney she'd built 3 times before it worked properly. About the rabbit blanket. About the fever breaking on the 4th morning and the decision that had come with the clarity of it. Yes, she said. It was enough. It was... Something moved across Bram's face. Relief partly. But something else too. Something that looked like the resolution of a question that had been open for a long time. He opened the satchel. He took out a letter. Folded old, the paper thickened with age. He held it out to her. He wrote this near the end, for the family. He paused. There's a part I never understood. I think maybe you will. She took the letter, moved to the entrance where the light was better, read it slowly. Most of it was for his family, making peace, accounting for the years. The language of a man who had gone away, found himself, and been reconciled. Warm and plain and entirely without drama. Near the end, one paragraph stood apart. The hollow oak is still there. I am certain of it. Old things like that do not leave. I left what I could in it for whoever came after. I do not know their name. I do not need to. I know the kind of person this place chooses because I was that person once. Not broken, almost ready. There is a difference, and it is everything. The hollow does not keep the broken one. It keeps the ones who are almost ready. And the ones who are almost ready always become something worth becoming. Eliza read it twice. Almost ready. Not broken. Almost ready. She stood in the entrance of her home and looked at the autumn valley through the frame of the ancient doorway. The leaves were turning, gold and deep red against the gray-blue sky. The creek, still running lower now, quieter, the summer's fullness easing into autumn restraint. Almost ready. She thought about the girl who had stood at the edge of these woods 13 months ago with a canvas sack and 3 days of food and absolutely no idea what she was doing. Was she broken then? She had felt broken. She had felt hollowed out and discarded and small. But she had walked forward. Not because she was brave, because she did not know what else to do, and the hollow had kept her, and she had become. He didn't die alone, Bram said quietly behind her. I want you to know that. He came back to the family eventually, made his peace, lived another 20 years. A pause. He talked about this place until the end, said it was where he learned who he was. She folded the letter carefully and handed it back. Thank you, she said, for coming. Bram looked at her. How long will you stay here? She looked at the valley, at the oak around her, at the carved fox on the shelf and the stacked firewood and the door she had built with her own hands from willow saplings. As long as it needs me, she said, which was not quite the same as forever, which was she was beginning to understand its own kind of answer. Bram stayed 2 days. He slept by the outer wall of the hollow on a bedroll he carried in his satchel, and in the evenings they sat by the small fire, and she read him passages from Augustus's journal that she thought he should hear. The parts about partnership, about the particular ease of being known, about winter and the way it clarifies things. Bram listened carefully. On the second evening, he said, he would have liked you. She thought about that. I think I already know him, she said. From the journal. Bram nodded slowly. He had a way of being present on the page. He looked at the fire. Even now. After he left, she sat with it for a long time. The way Augustus had reached forward through 18 years and put his hands around the shoulders of a 12-year-old girl he had never met and said, use what I have left. Build what they told you that you could not. The way her mother had reached forward through 3 years of guilt and shame and had left the only thing she had to give in a place she hoped would someday be found. Different hands, different distances, different kinds of reaching, same direction. She picked up her knife and the block of pine she had been working on for a week. She was making something new. She wasn't sure what it was yet. The shape was still arriving. She followed the grain in the way Silas had taught her patient not forcing. letting the wood tell her. She worked until the fire burned low. Then she looked at what was in her hands. A woman, standing upright this time, not sitting still, standing with her weight forward like someone who has just taken a step and is deciding whether to take another. Eliza set her down on the shelf beside the fox and the deer, looked at her for a while. Then she made a decision. She had been making it slowly over weeks, maybe longer. The way decisions that matter take shape in the body before the mind acknowledges them. It had started with what Nora said about her mother. It had grown with Bram's letter and Augustus's words. It had been building through the long autumn evenings by the fire when she would find her thoughts moving not backward exactly, but sideways, toward Dunmore's Hollow, toward a creek she knew before this one, toward a woman with narrow hands who had been in her own frightened way reaching. She was not going back. That was clear. That had been clear since the first winter. But there was something unfinished. Not unfinished like a wound. Unfinished like a conversation that had been interrupted and left hanging in the air between two people for so long it had become its own kind of weight. She needed to set it down, not for her mother's sake, for her own. She packed carefully the morning she left. The locket and its cloth went into the inner pocket of her coat against her ribs. The robin went into her left-hand pocket, the knife at her belt. Her coat was better than it had been a year ago, reinforced with a band of mink along the collar that Jonah had helped her cure. She told Jonah first. He came by on his October circuit, and she told him where she was going and why, keeping it brief, because she had learned that Jonah Ward responded better to facts than to explanation. He looked at her for a long moment. You want company? No. A pause. You want me to check on the hollow while you're gone? She felt something warm and small move through her chest. Yes, she said. Please. He nodded once. The nod of a man who will do what he says without being reminded. She told Nora the evening before she left. They sat at Nora's kitchen table with coffee and the particular quiet of two people who had stopped needing to fill silence with noise. How long will it take you? 2 days each way. I won't stay. Nora looked at her steadily. What do you need to say to her? Eliza thought about it honestly. Nothing, she said finally. I don't need to say anything. I just need to go and come back. Nora was quiet for a moment. Some things you have to do in person, she said, even when the words don't matter. Yes, that. Exactly that. The walk to Dunmore's Hollow took 2 days and a morning. She knew the route in reverse, the path she had walked away from 14 months ago, but walking it in the opposite direction felt entirely different. The forest she had fled through in fear and fever was the same forest she had come to know in every season. Every tree was recognizable now. Every turn in the creek was mapped in her body. She was not running. She was choosing. She arrived at the edge of the settlement in the late afternoon of the second day. She stopped at the tree line, looked at the cluster of cabins from a distance, the familiar smoke from the chimneys, the particular way the light hit the church's cracked bell in the afternoon, the road still muddy from last week's rain. Same, everything exactly the same. Which was strange, because she was entirely different. She did not go in. She followed the tree line around to the south side of the settlement, where she knew the creek ran closest to the cabins, where the women of the settlement sometimes went in the late afternoon to fetch the last water of the day or rinse out the morning's wash. She found a spot on the creek bank, a fallen log half buried in moss. She sat down on it, and she waited. She was prepared to wait a long time. As it turned out, she did not have to. 40 minutes after she settled on the log, she heard footsteps on the path above the bank. She recognized them. Some sounds are built into you so early they never leave. The exact rhythm of your mother's walk. The particular weight of her step. Eliza had known that sound before she knew anything else. Helen Cross appeared at the top of the bank. She was carrying a wooden pail, looking at the ground in front of her feet, moving with the slightly compressed posture of someone who had been tired for a long time. She reached the bottom of the bank. She set the pail at the creek's edge, and then she looked up and saw her daughter. The sound she made was very small. Both hands went to her mouth. Eliza stood up from the log. They looked at each other across 10 feet of Autumn Creek bank. Helen had aged. More than 14 months should have aged a person. There was something worn into her face that hadn't been there before, or had been there and was simply visible now in a way it hadn't been when Eliza was too close to see it clearly. Her eyes were her mother's eyes, dark, watchful, holding everything they had ever seen. "You're alive," Helen said, her voice barely above a sound. "I am." A silence. Helen's hands were shaking. "I looked for you." The words coming out like they had been held in under pressure for a long time. "Your father, he didn't want me to, but I went anyway. 3 times I went into those woods. I called your name until..." She stopped. "I found the valley. I found the tree." "I know," Eliza said. Helen looked at her. "You found it." "I found it." Another silence, longer. The creek running between them cold and clear and indifferent. "I should have spoken," Helen said. "When they were deciding, I should have..." "Yes," Eliza said quietly. "You should have. Not cruel, not soft, just true." Helen absorbed it without flinching. She had, Eliza thought, been waiting to hear exactly that, had perhaps been saying it to herself every day for 14 months. "I know," her mother said. "I know." Eliza reached into her coat. She took out the cloth bundle. She unfolded it and held out the locket. It lay across her palm on its delicate chain, the afternoon light catching the worn engraving of small leaves around its edge. Helen looked at it for a long moment. "I found your letter," Eliza said. "I read it." Helen's eyes fill. "Then you know." "I know." A silence. "Keep it," Eliza said. "It belongs with you." Helen shook her head, a small, urgent motion. "It was always for you. I meant it for you when you were born. I just—" She stopped. "I was afraid of your father's face. I was afraid of the silence afterward. I was afraid of so many things that I know," Eliza said again. And she did. She understood it the way you understand a thing you have had a long time to think about. Her mother had not been a strong woman. That was not a condemnation. It was a fact. Helen Cross had loved her daughter and had not had the courage her love required. And that was a real and serious failing. And it was also human. And it was also now 14 months of cold and work and fire and the knowledge of Silas Reed and the tools of Augustus Hale and the patience of Jonah Ward and the steady, irreversible fact of Nora Alcott standing like proof that women survived these things later. It was survivable. She had survived it. Helen reached out and took the locket from Eliza's palm. Her fingers closed over it. She held it to her chest. The gesture was so familiar. So exactly the gesture Eliza had watched every day of her childhood. Her mother's hand going to that spot at her collarbone. It hurt a little, which was fine. Hurt that you could feel from a safe distance was different from hurt that lived in the same room as you. "Declan came to your father last winter," Helen said suddenly. Eliza went still. "He told him." Helen's voice was careful now, carrying something heavy. "Told him about the gambling, about the man he sold it to, about all of it." A pause. "Your father has not spoken to him since." The silence stretched. Eliza thought about her brother, 15 years old and charming, and the smile that got him out of almost everything. Almost. "He's been living with it," Helen said, "whatever that's worth." "It's worth something," Eliza said, because it was. She was not going to perform bitterness she didn't entirely feel. Declan had done a terrible thing and had taken 14 months to confess it, and had been the direct cause of everything that had happened to her. And also, he had confessed it, eventually, in his own time, to his own father, which was not nothing, which was not absolution either, but it was not nothing. "Where are you living?" Helen asked. "In the valley." "Alone?" with people nearby. Helen searched her face. Are you... She stopped, started again. Are you well? And here it was, the question. Are you well? Not the elaborate question it should have been. Not did you survive the winter? Did you find food? Did you know that I went looking for you? Do you know that I think about you every single day? Do you know that the worst thing I have ever done in my life was stand at that window and watch you walk away and say nothing? Just, are you well? Because that was what Helen Cross had to offer. Imperfect and limited and constrained by everything she was and wasn't. But real, a real question, sincerely meant. Eliza looked at her mother's face, at the worn-in tiredness, at the dark eyes that were her own eyes, at the hands still closed around the locket. Yes, she said, I'm well. Helen closed her eyes briefly, let out a breath that seemed to have been held for a very long time. When she opened them again, they were clearer. Will you come back? Eliza was quiet for a moment. No, she said, not to stay. Helen nodded, as if she had known that was the answer before she asked. But I might come through, Eliza said. Sometimes, when I'm passing. It was not much, but it was true, and true was more valuable than much. Helen stood there on the creek bank with her wooden pail at her feet and her locket in her hand, and her daughter in front of her, taller than she remembered, calmer than she had ever been entirely herself, in a way that Helen had never quite seen before, or had seen actually, had always seen, had simply not known what to do with. You're like her, Helen said quietly, almost to herself. Eliza looked at her. Like who? Your grandmother. Helen's voice went soft. My mother. She was the same way. The world never quite had a place that fit her, so she made her own places. A small pause. I always thought it was a problem, the not fitting. She looked at her daughter steadily. I understand now that it wasn't. Eliza held that, filed it in the deep place where she kept the things that would need time. Then she stepped forward, and briefly, for just a moment, she put her arms around her mother. Helen went very still, then held on, hard. Not long, a minute, maybe less. Then Eliza stepped back, adjusted the strap of her pack on her shoulder. Take care of yourself, she said. Helen's voice when she answered was not quite steady. You too. Eliza turned and walked back into the trees. She did not look back, not because she was angry, not because she was finished, because she knew how that story ended. She had been in it before. And the version of this she was writing now did not include the backward look, did not include the weight of what was behind her dragging at her heels. She walked forward, the way she had always walked. The return journey was different from every other journey she had made. She was not afraid. She was not in flight. She was not calculating survival, or measuring resources, or pushing through fever or cold. She was simply moving through a world that was hers, every tree familiar, every bend in the creek known. The light through the canopy at this hour, in this season, a specific gold she had come to recognize. The way you recognize the face of someone you love. She walked for 2 days. She thought about her mother's face when she first saw her. That small sound. Both hands going to her mouth. She thought about Declan living with his confession. Whatever that looked like. Whatever it cost him. She hoped it cost him something. She also, which surprised her, hoped he was all right. Both things. At the same time. Which was maybe what growing up actually felt like. She thought about Augustus Hale finding his way back to his family, making his peace, dying 20 years later in warmth and reconciliation. The hollow oak having given him what he needed to become someone who could go back. Not back to the person he had been, back to the people he had left. Different, healed enough. She thought maybe that is what the hollow does. Not fixes you, not saves you, not makes you someone you weren't. Gives you the space to become the version of yourself that was almost ready, and then sends you back into the world, changed. She arrived home in the late afternoon of the second day. The valley appeared as it always did when she came in from the east, the great oak visible first above the tree line, its upper branches still carrying the last of the autumn gold. The rest of the leaves already fallen and lying in a thick, quiet carpet around its roots. Jonah Ward was sitting on a root outside the hollow, whittling. She stopped. He looked up. Good trip. Yes. He looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of a man who was not going to ask anything more than he was invited to ask. Nora came by yesterday, he said, brought bread. Eliza's chest did something warm and small. I'll go see her tomorrow. Jonah nodded, went back to his whittling. She went inside. The fire was low, but not out. He had tended it. She added wood, watched the flame catch and grow the familiar light filling the hollow walls. The carved fox on the shelf, the deer, the standing woman with her weight forward. She took the robin from her pocket, set him on the shelf beside the others. She took the cloth bundle from inside her coat, unwrapped it. The locket lay on her palm. She had not given it back. At the last moment at the creek bank when she had held it out to her mother, something had shifted. She had felt it. Helen's hands shaking, the way she had held it against her chest. Her mother needed the locket more than Eliza did. But Eliza had something her mother had put inside it. She opened it. The folded paper, the careful handwriting, the words her mother had chosen twice before committing them. I am a coward, but you are not. You never were. She closed it again. She had decided something on the walk home. She was going to keep the letter, not out of bitterness, not to hold over anyone, but because it was hers, because it was true, because there would be days she knew even in this life she had built when she would need the reminder. Not that her mother loved her. She knew that. She had always known that. But that she herself was not what they had decided she was. On that day, in that room, without asking, without looking at her face. She was not the thief they had named. She was not the strange liability who did not fit. She was the girl who had walked into the deep woods with nothing and found something no one had predicted and built a life in it from scratch, from cold, from the kindness of a dead man's letter and a living woman's directness and an old trapper's refusal to ask questions she hadn't offered answers to. From the knowledge of a man who had carved birds from pine blocks and believed that what you were looking for was already there inside the wood, waiting for someone quiet enough to find it. She set the letter on the shelf, beside the standing woman, beside the robin, beside everything she had made. Outside, the autumn dusk settled into the valley with its particular finality, the last light going gold and thin through the upper canopy of the oak. The creek murmuring at its fall level, steady and unhurried. The sound of Jonah's knife against wood, rhythmic and quiet. Inside, the fire burned. Eliza sat down in the center of her home, her hands in her lap, just still. Not empty still, full still. The still of someone who has done the necessary thing and come back to the place where she belongs. She was 13 years old. She had been cast out with a name that was not hers. She had walked into the dark and the cold and found a room in the heart of a living thing and made it into something that held her the way nothing had ever held her before. She had been taught by a man who said the bird is already in there. She had been trusted by a man who had never met her. She had been seen by a woman who looked at her and said, "So will you," as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. She had forgiven her mother. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough to go there and stand on a creek bank and put the locket in her hand and say, "Keep it. It belongs with you." That was forgiveness, the real kind. Not the kind that pretended nothing had happened. The kind that said, "I see exactly what happened. I see exactly what you are. And I am choosing not to carry it anymore. Not for your sake, for mine." That kind of forgiveness, the kind you build like a chimney, slowly, with your own hands, one layer at a time, testing it until it draws clean. The fire crackled quietly. Jonah came to the entrance and stood there for a moment. "Nora's coming tomorrow morning," he said. "She said she'd bring the winter herb bundles." "Good." He looked at her for a moment, at the fire and the carved shelf and the letter and the standing woman and the robin. "You all right?" he said. She looked at the fire, thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." He nodded once, went back outside, and Eliza Cross sat in the center of the home she had built, in the heart of the oldest tree in the valley, in the deep, full quiet of a life that was hers, not given, not inherited, not restored, built, completely and entirely built, from nothing into this. Some homes are made of timber and stone, handed down, inherited, given by people who came before and shaped the space you were born into. And some homes are made of something else entirely, of patience, of careful work in cold weather, of the kindness of strangers who asked for nothing back, of the decision made over and over to keep going when stopping would have been easier. Eliza Cross was 12 years old when they called her a thief and sent her into the woods. She was 13 years old when she came back to the edge of the world that had discarded her. Not to reclaim her place in it, not to prove anything to anyone who hadn't been asking, just to set something down and pick herself back up and walk home to the hollow, to the oak, to the life that had been waiting inside her all along, just like the bird in the wood, already there, all along.